So the case manager, how do you get this data? The case manager should make a data sheet following the IEP. So if the case manager is the author of the IEP and responsible for the IEP for inviting everybody and coming up with the long-term goals, the short-term goals, the strategies, and the measurement, then we also have to basically complete this picture by providing data sheets. But I talk to lots of special educators, case managers who will say, I was never taught how to make these data sheets. They often invite me to help them make the data sheets. Richard, if you want to take the data sheets, fabulous, because I'm really not sure how to do that. So really it just takes recognizing that we need it and then working together to come up with the data sheet, whatever data is going to work. It should be kept in a student binder or on a clipboard or in some way available so that the EA has it with them throughout the day. If things are locked away in a filing cabinet in another room, the data won't get collected. So I like to take the Coles notes of the IEP, the big ideas, try to summarize all of it into a single page of paper, and the EA takes that single page of paper with them every day. And it has two purposes. One, it acts like a job aid, which is this redundant visual cue that reminds you of what you're supposed to be doing every day in terms of delivering the special education program. And of course, it doesn't all have to fall to the EA by any stretch. And it also allows them to take the data as they go throughout the day in one concise area. I forgot to include an example of this, but there are QR codes you can get for data so that if the EA has their phone with them and you complete an activity, they can actually just scan the QR code associated with the activity and a data sheet will show up. So there are technological innovations to do this. I haven't actually used those. At the end of the day, the case manager, when we're thinking about the data that I just shared with you, this is how we got it. The case manager then inputted the data into Excel at the end of every day, and after setting it up, it might only take 3 or 4 minutes a day to input the data. Now I can hear the case managers going, but I've got 17 kids I'm responsible for. That then does become impractical. You can't expect the case manager to input all this data for all these kids every day. It just becomes impractical. So why not teach the education assistant to do it or the classroom teacher to do it? Again, data is a tool, and you can make the tool as lean and mean as you need it to be. Right? It has to be practical, otherwise it won't work. I completely understand that. So this is what the special education teacher said. This made report card time easy as I had all the information I needed instead of asking EAs how they think each student is progressing or them writing up little reports, anecdotal reports. They just put graphs in the IEP. Graphs in the IEP speak for themselves. They are very impressive. They are just so concise. And I share these examples with you, and many of you are thinking, like, that's really impressive. How do we get that? But this shouldn't be that impressive. It should simply be the standard. We just have a long way to go to get this. It shouldn't be the anomaly. I shouldn't have to share data like this and go, wow, that's pretty exceptional. It's really should just be the day-to-day practice. Now, let me tell you a story about getting data collection. I worked with a special education department in a school a number of years ago, and I gave a talk like this that the special education coordinator attended and was very motivated. And she said, all right, Richard, next year we are going to have data for every student's IEP. You're going to be in to help me do that. We set it up. We had the IEP meetings. We made smart objectives. I helped them make data sheets for every student. We gave them to the EAs. The EAs seemed to be keen. We moved forward into September and October with this plan. And by the end of the year, we recognized that our initiative to collect data, somebody who was really motivated, as I'm sure many of you are feeling right now, it completely bombed. The EAs didn't take the data. And these were good EAs. I know these EAs, I like these EAs, but they didn't collect the data. And so we had to sit down at the end of the year and reflect on how did we have such a horrible outcome this year? And the reality was recognizing that the EAs have never had to do this before, right? They've literally never taken data on all short-term objectives for every student throughout the year, whether that was daily, weekly, or monthly data. It was essentially too big a behavior change. We were asking them to go from never doing something to doing something every day. That's like taking somebody who is unhealthy physically and does not eat well and does not exercise and saying, starting tomorrow every day, you're going to eat a perfectly healthy diet and you're going to exercise 2 hours a day and it'll be good for you. it's probably not going to happen. Why? Because it's simply too big a change all at once. It's like why New Year's resolutions fail. This was our New Year's resolution, literally for the school year. It was too big and it totally failed. And so the next year we went back and thought, okay, how do we move forward to get this behavior change to happen, to get people to do things they've never had to do? We came up with a few ideas. One is we're going to start small. For each education assistant, and we're going to include choice. So, for each education assistant who's responsible for a student, we would sit down with them in the IEP and we'd say, all right, last year, remember we gave you that data sheet? Like, yeah, we didn't use that. Yeah, we know we didn't use that. We want to take data on one thing this year, and we want you to pick what that thing will be. And the EAs are now involved. It is a small, realistic behavior change. It's almost like a short-term objective for the education assistants, right? A good short-term objective is a realistic expectation. We had been unrealistic the year before. So the EAs got to pick one thing. They got to choose it, which means they had, had goodness of fit, they had buy-in, and they had control over what it was going to be. And then we had them help make up the data sheet, and we moved forward. And under those circumstances, we started to be more successful. The EAs started to collect data. Now, there's a big gap between starting there and getting all the data we need, but if you think about the idea of behavioral shaping is to take some kind of a precursor of something that's not yet happening and to morph it towards what you want to see happening. And with shaping, you move through successive approximations, baby steps towards your terminal objective. So then the next objective might be to get them to take data on 2 pieces of the IEP, and then 3, or maybe 1 per long-term goal area. You've got 4 types of data that you're collecting, right? So you want to shape it up. And so I would encourage those of you who are in schools and thinking, yeah, this is just, it's too much, like we can't get there. You don't have to get there tomorrow. That's why I started at the beginning of today to say you just need to take some data. Think of your first successive approximation, your first baby step. Where can you start collecting some data? And then move forward. So that's a starting point. The other thing you need to really keep in mind is, if I was an education assistant and I've never had to do this before, and I don't get paid more to do it, I don't get paid less if I don't do it, we're lacking contingencies to reinforce this behavior or to occasion the behavior. If I actually do take this data and I don't see that anyone's looking at it or making any decisions with it, I'm going to stop taking this data, right? Because it's really become a pointless exercise. The tool is not being used to achieve the outcome. So it's really important that if we take the data, that we then look at the data. So the examples that I've shared with you, all the graphs I've shared with you, were data collected by education assistants. What made that possible is either I was in there looking at the data with them incrementally, like a couple times per month, so they saw somebody was looking at it and using it, and or the the case manager took that data, summarized it, or took the graphs that the EA made and shared it with other people, shared it with the family in the presence of the EA. Right? Nothing is more reinforcing to an education assistant who's now engaging in this new effortful behavior than to see it shared with the parent and the parent to go, wow, this is awesome. We've never seen this before. This is outstanding. Thank you. Right? Now that's automatically reinforcing or socially reinforcing for the education assistant. There has to be some reinforcement. They're not going to get paid more for doing this, but the Ministry of Education does expect there to be measurement of IEPs. So if we can't pay people to take the data, as we're adding this to what they're doing, or they haven't been doing it, but they should be doing it, what are the motivators? What are the consequences, right? That's a natural reinforcing social consequence to see that it's used. So I'd really be thinking about that. That motivates people to keep doing it. And if you can the other thing to keep in mind is when you want someone to do something new, and this applies to all of us, the easier it is, the more likely it is to occur, right? That's another reason why people's New Year's resolutions fail, because they try to make this big change that requires too much effort. They should have used a successive approximations shaping approach. They should have tried to make a little change first with a little bit of effort, not a huge amount of effort. So start with low effort. Pick the IEP objective that's going to be the easiest to measure, and then show that you're using that data, okay? That's one of the big ideas there. So I mentioned to you these data sheets where you take the IEP and you put them together on a piece of paper. Here's some examples. This is for Freddie in grade 9. You can see here there's 2 weeks of data here, Monday through Friday for 2 weeks. Short-term objective 1.1 is expected behavior during break and lunch. This is not the full wording of the short-term objective. This is an abbreviated title just for the sake of the data sheet. Doing his math program, his literacy program, and this student, even though he was fully integrated in grade 9, he didn't know how to tie his shoes, so we're teaching him to tie his shoes. And so you can see the break and lunch. There's room for taking data, both break and lunch, 2 boxes. And then for Math UC, they would be recording the lesson that they're working on. And the literacy program, either data is collected here or a check mark to show that they worked on it. At the very least, this is accountability that you are doing the teaching, and there may be a literacy program data sheet in a binder for the literacy program, similar to the shoe tying. So this is, and again, you can see this is extremely lean and mean. This isn't necessarily all of the IEP, but this was starting to get the EA to take this type of data. Here's another one for Debbie. Participate in conversation as a listener and speaker. There's 2 blocks throughout the day. Practice replacing her sanitary napkins. So this is menstrual care for this teenage girl. So here's something to point out. This is a very personal target here around self-care and hygiene. Her name is at the top of this data sheet. In reality, that would never happen, because what if you dropped this data sheet and somebody found a data sheet, a student, and saw this, and they can figure out who Debbie is, and they can see something very personal about her self-care and her hygiene. That is a threat to her dignity. And so you have to make sure that you're protecting confidentiality and protecting people's dignity when you have data sheets like this. Just a side note. She's also learning to tie her shoes. Identify and label feelings of stress in her body, use her calming strategies, do her math program. Again, this is not the full wording of a good STO. That would be in her IEP. This is just an abbreviated title to remind people that you're working on this. Here's another one. Right, follow-up questions. This is a social goal. Appropriate volume and pronunciation, using her self-calming strategies. I don't have to read all these to you. The big idea isn't this person's goals. It's the idea that the goals are on a data sheet, and there's some type of data being taken, even if the first data is simply a check mark that we did these things today. That's not data on student performance. That's check mark on implementation, that you've actually implemented it. That might be a starting point. And then from there, you want to start to add up some of the students' performance data as you start to get people collecting data that they haven't done before. Here's one that was shared with permission from some special education teachers for elementary school students with autism, because I've been sharing some high school examples. I know some of you in the audience want to see the younger kid examples. These are for kids in a specialized program for kids with developmental disabilities in the Surrey School District. I had permission to share these. So I know you can't see this. This is just to give you a bird's eye view of what the one-page data sheet looks like. The whole IEP is here. Let me zoom in a little bit. You have the learning objective listed down this column. Right? This is taking the bird's eye view and zooming in. You have some data here, and there's a guide for whether there's independent responses, partially prompted, fully prompted, gestural prompt, model prompt, verbal prompt, no prompt. There's some percent correct data that can be recorded here, and then a little section for comments. And so it's very much individualized to the goal for the student. Right? If I look down here, he will label items and name the category it belongs to. So there's corrects and incorrects. There's the label item, there's the naming category, and you would have to know his program for this data sheet to really make sense to you, right? It's hard to explain this to you unless you have his IEP and the programming, the strategies for his particular IEP. But you can see there's a lot going on here. And you might wonder, how the heck did this happen? This is actually in a self-contained, well, by that I mean, did people actually use this and take data? This was in a self-contained classroom where the special education assistants were with the students and the supervising teacher in the same room most of the day, which created the contingencies for the teacher to ensure that the EAs were implementing this data collection. There's the bottom of that data sheet. So you can see that some of the data is percent correct, some of it is just yes, no data. It really depends on what the target is. Here's another bird's eye view for another student. And you zoom in and you can see there's some swimming targets there, which of course requires going to a pool. There's some social targets. There's eating from own plate. Eat from own plate only during recess and lunch, right? Clearly this is an issue that this particular student is having. Uses their zipper on their pants for zipper up, right? There's opportunities to collect data for using the zipper throughout the day. Follow a routine to get dressed for outside, goes to coat room, changes shoes, puts on jacket. There's a task analysis of the steps in that chain. And again, this is probably information overload. You're like, pause, explain that, what does it mean? This isn't an example of what you should do with your students. This is an example of what you can do to collect data. This is a pretty Cadillac version of what you could possibly be doing. And so these are in your handout. You can take a look at them. They're meant to be just inspiration. Again, this is certainly overkill for any of you where you're recognizing this isn't happening. If you're a parent, you're thinking, I'm not seeing data for my child's program. If you're an education, special education teacher, and you're not doing this for your IEPs yet, this is not where you're starting. This would be maybe where you're going. But our goal right now is just to get some data, to get some buy-in, to get the education assistants, the teacher, or yourselves to be collecting some data that you could possibly graph, even if it's a hand graph, just to have that impartial story that's told through the data as opposed to anecdotes.